Let's go ahead and kick things off with some introductions. So my name's Matt. I work here at Prevalent in business development, and today we have a returning guest, Bryan Littlefair. He's the CEO of Cambridge Cyber Advisors. He also has experience as a former CISO of the Vodafone Group and Aviva. Welcome back, Bryan.
Thanks, Matt. Hey, good to see everyone.
And last but not least, we also have Scott Lang joining us today. Scott's our VP of Product Marketing, and he will dive into how we are able to mature your TPRM program at the end of the session. Hey, Scott.
Hey, Matt. How you doing?
Good to see you. Good to see you. All right. So, just as a little bit of housekeeping, this webinar is being recorded. So you'll get this and the slideshow shortly after the webinar. Lastly, you're all muted, so just please use the Q&A box function for any questions you may have during the webinar. And without further ado, I'll go ahead and hand things over to Bryan as he shares the top risks that your TPRM program might be missing. Go ahead, Bryan.
Thanks, Matt. Really appreciate the introduction. So, hi everyone. As Matt said, I'm Bryan. I'm looking forward to presenting this topic to you today. A little bit of my housekeeping. I've got a bit of a cold, so I will be drinking water. I've got a bit of a sore throat, but we will happily get through this topic. So what we're going to be discussing today, as Matt said, is top risks that your TPM program might be missing or may be missing. And we're actually going to be focusing on the non-IT related risks, right? So I think as, security professionals, which the predominant people probably on the call are, we tend to focus down on the information, the data, the cyber risk, etc. But I'm going to be looking at some of the other risks and angles that I personally think, in order to have a fully rounded TPRM program, you have to include, and maybe that we all haven't got them baked in just yet, right? So a little bit about me. There's my picture. You can see that. So a little bit of scene setting, a couple of slides before we get in. So we know from statistics, Prevalent does their own, reviews and questionnaires, etc. But equally, broader in the third-party risk management space, we know that quite often, or in the majority of cases, the responsibility for conducting TPRM traditionally sits within the security function, whatever that function is called. And therefore, as I said, our priority is to focus down on that cyber and information security risks. But we're not the only recipient of this data, and we're not the only people that should be contributing to, the data set that's collected and analyzed on behalf of our customer base. So I still think that trend is going to continue. The security team under the CISO is still going to be, the prime users. But in order to get that full holistic risk picture, I've done a webinar before on how important it is to liaise and work with the procurement function. But equally, we've got legal, we've got risk, we've got compliance where it exists. And they all have interests in the data that should be within your TPRM program. And quite frankly, they've all got different expertise, that complements the security skill set that can really help to build that enriched picture of, how risky is this supplier to our business going forward. We all know about regulation, love it or hate it. It's here to stay. And I think, the level of regulation that we're all going to experience, obviously, depending on the sector that you're in, is only going to go up. I've got a slide on regulation later on, but certainly since I started in IT/security many moons ago, the amount of regulation that we're subjected to at the moment is 10, 20 fold what it was back then. So I think that trend is only going to continue. It says there, the latest Verizon threat report, 62% of system compromises came via the partner and supplier channel. I think we all know through our threat intelligence sources that, the hacktivist groups, etc., are definitely focus on the supply chain as their most lucrative attack vector, phishing being the most used vehicle. But in terms of targeting organizations, why target one specific organization and put all your effort into that when you can target a major supplier and get hold of thousands, tens of thousands of their customers that are connected into their platforms and systems. So this is a very real threat. It's not scareware or fear, uncertainty, and doubt, as sometimes it's called. It's something that's very real, and we have to be tuned into that and understand how we can potentially mitigate that going forward. So today we know all of this, right? We understand this. We understand what we need to be focusing on. But as I say, what we're going to be focusing on today are those areas that we're probably not focusing on a day-to-day basis, which is the non-IT areas and how important they can be in ensuring our holistic cyber risk. So what does that holistic business aligned approach actually look like? So I'm a great advocate of being business aligned. I think if you are a CISO or a head of security, whatever the title is, if you're not fully aligned behind your business strategy, then you're operating in a silo, and silos don't really help anyone. So, getting not just your TPRM strategy, but your whole, information slash cybersecurity strategy fully aligned behind the business that you're trying to protect. So really and truly understanding that business, what products does it offer? What geographies does it operate in? What's its approach to delivering to customers? Is it direct to the consumer, or is it a B2B organization? Because all of this ultimately changes your risk profile. So you have to decide, if I'm going to run an effective TPRM function, what are the outputs that I need to deliver into the business so they can, make sensible choices around the strategy going forward. And that's ultimately what this program is there to do, right? It understands what external suppliers are required for the business to operate, and what risks do they present to a continuity of service and potentially the reputation of the organization, and how do we make sure that that continues going forward. And I've been in security long enough when great tools like Prevalent weren't available. I would definitely started when Microsoft Excel was the only tool available to us, and we had huge long complex spreadsheets where we're trying to track remediation in thousands of different suppliers. And I know some of you might still be in that world today. And it's definitely a challenge to do an effective TPRM program on Microsoft Excel. Some of the cool tricks like real-time updates on performance of suppliers, the threat intelligence aspects, you just can't do that on Microsoft Excel. It obviously wasn't designed to run a third-party function, and that's why tools like Prevalent have been developed. So yeah, we absolutely need to make sure we've got the right tool. We need to make sure we've got the right resource in terms of people. I've never gone into an organization and seen their third party, TPRM function and thought, wow, there's far too many people in that. I often go into organizations and see, two or three people under-resourced, running manual processes, trying to actually get a handle on what is a key strategic risk for the organization, and quite frankly struggling to do it because that either they're not skilled enough, or what is the main problem is they haven't got the right tools at their fingertips to obviously drive it forward. So we need to recognize that we're collecting a very rich data source here. We need to make sure that we amass all of that together. We get an aligned view of risk across the organization. I talk about it in my other webinars for Prevalent as well. The silo thing, again, it's not just organizational. There's no point collecting all of this data and just keeping it within the security function. And equally, there's no point having, two different views on the risk that a supplier presents to your organization. So if security have a view and then perhaps procurement have a view on a different system that they're using, then obviously we've got two lenses within the same business, and that doesn't make any sense. So really a consolidation down and a collaboration across all the different business units on a really professional tool will pay dividends on, being able to manage the risk within your organization. So let's talk about, the scope and segmentation, because these really are critical to not being able to actually assess your risk within your supplier footprint. We can't put the same level of focus and attention on every single supplier that, supplies products or services into our organization. So all too often, I think, TPRM programs sometimes aren't truly global. So I go into large multinational organizations and I see a really effective process in their home country or home region. And then when you say, well, how is this process run in Asia? How is this program run in Europe or America, etc.? It's not always to the same level of governance, not always to the same level of standards and things like that. So it's really making sure that you have, where possible, a global process, where possible, you have a global tool. And there's a big reason for that, right? If you reverse this question and look at it from a supplier lens, they're obviously incentivized to sell as much of their product and service as they can. And they will divide and conquer an organization. I've seen it many times, even in organizations that I've run. If you haven't got the right governance over that supplier and control over their interaction within your organization, not only will you have different service levels and different risks, you'll also have different prices and different SLAs, etc., all over the globe. So it really makes sense to understand everywhere where that supplier operates and interacts with your organization. And in order to do that, obviously, you have to be truly global. Regulation definitely exists in this space. It would be great if the regulators would start to standardize their approach. I've spent a lot of personal time with regulators explaining that there's such a heavy overlap over, some of the regulations around the globe, but each individual country or nation, etc., wants to have their own individual set of regulatory standards that apply to different sectors within their remit. So even though they're fairly common, there are nuances and differences between them. So it's important that we fully understand them and understand what they are. And I get onto that a little bit later on. But equally, again, a plug for Prevalent. I should just say, in my jobs that I've worked, for large multinational organizations, I speak on behalf of Prevalent because, I've used the tool in earnest. I understand the value that it can definitely deliver into an organization. So it's really, imperative that our program covers the full life cycle of a supplier as well. All too often we front load that, that effort and resource. So we've got a new supplier coming into the organization. So we, throw everything at it, understand the ownership model, understand where they operate, etc. But we don't always, keep that effort up. If they are a tier one or critical supplier to our organization, and obviously some tier twos as well, we need to make sure that we've got a constant monitoring on that organization. And again, for those of you that are using Microsoft Excel or even a manual process of sending out questionnaires, you've only really got, if you think about it, an update coming in every 12 months. You haven't got a real-time lens on what's happening to that company, what's happening to its financial state, has it had a breach, etc. And sometimes you can be blindsided that one of your suppliers has had a big incident. Your senior stakeholders in the organization know about it, but perhaps you don't. So you want to find out about it first, and you want to be the one advising the business, not the other way around. So in order to be able to do this effectively, which is hopefully what we all want to do, we need to make sure we have that holistic coverage of everything that we're accountable for. And that segmentation down into the tiers is really, really critical as well. And we get onto the nth as well. So many people don't look at the nth, and I think that's really, really important. So by nth, I mean the vendors of your vendors. So you might give out a contract to, one of your suppliers. They might subcontract that to other suppliers that potentially you're not aware of. But certainly in regulated sectors, when we're talking about PII, personally identifiable information, that's really critical that you know that end-to-end path of that data. And we talk about that a little bit later on as well. So let's look at the buckets of activity that we're going to focus on for what I think the non-IT risks that I personally think are critical that we monitor going forward. So one is operational. So making sure that our partners and suppliers have the ability to continue to service the product or service that we've procured from them. We need to make sure that their business continuity, that their disaster recovery, and a whole host of other measures are up to scratch. Otherwise, if something happens to them, equally by default, something happens to us. And how can we potentially hedge that risk as well? Then obviously we've got the world of compliance. We're very familiar to this in the world of cybersecurity, but obviously it's broader than information and cybersecurity. There's lots of other compliance regulations that we need to be aware of as well. And then depending on where you are in the world, the CSR/ESG requirements, we all want to be good global citizens. We all want to make sure that our products and services are amazing, absolutely, but we don't want to be exploiting anyone to get to that point. So how can we make sure when we've outsourced or offshored to far shored countries that we've got that same level of governance and control over what we're looking to achieve? And then financial, making sure that, the liquidity of that organization is strong, making sure that they're not going to go bankrupt tomorrow, which would leave us again, an inability to service our customers when a key supplier goes bankrupt. So I'm going to go into each of these areas with a little bit of depth. I'm going to obviously give some examples, but as Matt said at the beginning, feel free to put any questions in the chat and I'll get around to those as well. So let's look at operational risk. So a couple of examples, I'm going to go into these as well. So we've got obviously COVID. So we've got, a global pandemic causing issues. We've got political instability. We've got the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We've got the potential of China invading Taiwan. And then we've got logistical challenges as well. So not immediately cyber related, but can absolutely have an impact on our organization's ability to run its business. So global events can, and as we've seen, will obviously impact your organization. And I don't think operational risk is often given, the credence or the seriousness it deserves based on the impact it can have on your organization. Obviously, we've seen what can happen with, global conflicts in nations. They significantly disrupted global trade, both physically and virtually. So this just isn't a logistics issue. Many people had, organizations that were working with in both Russia and Ukraine. Ties with Russia had to be severed. Lots of the workforce within Ukraine had to pick up arms, etc. So, workforces and employees disappeared overnight. So it doesn't just have to be a physical asset that you're procuring. If the resource disappears, then if you're using, coders or developers, etc., and they're no longer available, then that digital asset is also disrupted as well. And, operational challenges can easily lead to household names going bankrupt as well. I've put the example up of Revlon, and it's really interesting in their bankruptcy claim in the US, they actually cited the inability to manufacture sufficient product and wholesaler imposed fines as their reason for filing the bankruptcy. So, their supply chain was disrupted. Access to raw materials was disrupted. They'd made commitments to their suppliers that they're going to deliver a certain amount of units every single month. They couldn't make those commitments. The penalties were significant back on the parent organization, and that just snowballed. And eventually, a household name like Revlon had to file for bankruptcy, citing supply chain as its major issue. But there are also many industries, relying on products and services from both Ukraine and Russia, as we just mentioned. Sorry. So if we look at, Ukraine's grain production, it's been very well publicized that, huge stocks of grain in Ukraine that are just stacking up, and, they can only get a very small percentage of the ships that would typically transport that grain outside of the organization. But actually 80% of that grain was bought up by the UN World Food Programme. So it has a huge impact on, developing nations and those in need of aid. So, that just disrupts, a huge onward supply chain. And then if we look at Russia, certainly in Europe, we had a massive reliance on, natural gas, big pipelines coming into several countries from Russia, which kind of stopped overnight. That had a massive impact on gas and oil prices here in the UK, which were already high, but went up to, exponential levels. But not just for, petrol, but pretty much every oil derivative, which, it caused huge onward challenges from the supply chain. And we really just have to think about, if that was Russia, Ukraine, if China were to invade Taiwan, and we think about if the same sanctions that we imposed on Russia were to be imposed on China, and think about our reliance on products, goods, services, outsourcing, on Chinese owned businesses and Chinese services, etc. Even things like logistics and shipping, which they're pretty much the magnates in, that would have a massive impact on pretty much all of our organizations, either directly or indirectly. So we need to model, based on past events. So what do we know about what happened in the past, and how do we, predict what would potentially happen in the future? Looking at our suppliers, are they overexposed, perhaps in a specific location that, potentially has the ability to have some political disruption? If you're Intel or AMD or an organization like that, and you look at Ukraine that produce 54% of your, world semiconductor grade neon, then, you would hope that they had a plan for, plan A, plan B, plan C, and D to kind of replace that, nearly 55% of, the neon that they would have been buying in from Ukraine, because that was and is significantly disrupted. And certainly when we saw the invasion and the war commence, the semiconductor industry certainly was affected by that. So then let's look at, compliance risks. So I mentioned, each individual location, and this is really only compliance around data security. kind of going with their own thing. So there's, lots of individual, regulations and focuses, and this is growing exponentially. That African continent is going to be pretty much filled up, I'd say, by, the next year or so. So lots of individual approaches to how data needs to be managed. And if you're, a national organization sitting within a single country, then obviously you only have to really be concerned about the citizens within that country. But if you're a global multinational operating, 60, 70 different countries, etc., then this becomes, highly complex for you to manage. Sorry, just advance that slide. So, people often think they can outsource their problems. I speak to many organizations where they say, well, that's not really an issue for us because we use this outsourcer. That's not the case, actually. So you can't outsource your problems when it comes to compliance. They certainly haven't gone away. You still remain the data owner. If your supplier has an issue in relation to your data, it's still your problem. The compliance landscape, as I mentioned, for multinationals, it's complex today. It's only going to get more and more complex as we move things forward. A tool like Prevalent can really help you, understand your individual compliance requirements in individual locations, and help with things like your internal or your external audits by producing reports on how things work in various different geographies and things like that. I think the common theme, as I just touched on, is, you take those 60 different requirements. The one thing that is common throughout them all is that you remain accountable. You can outsource responsibility, but you can't outsource the accountability. You can have someone run a process or process your data on your behalf, or run a call center and have access to your customer records, but ultimately, in the eyes of the regulator and the eyes of the legal systems in most countries, you remain accountable for that data. And that's where it becomes really, really critical to understand your nth exposure. If you've put a contract in place with an individual organization, have they outsourced that to someone else? And it's really critical when it comes to PII. So what can we do in this critical landscape? Obviously, use a tool like Prevalent. That's going to be really useful for you. If you have a data breach, the regulatory requirements in different locations have very different timeframes. I've spent most of my life working in financial services and telecommunications, so I know the regulatory landscape in those two sectors very well. And I know that if I have a breach in Singapore versus a breach in India, my response times have to be, notably different. The way in which I catalog the incident has to be very different. Who I tell and who gets engaged are very different as well. So you have to fully understand that and be able to have that front and center in your memory going forward. But there's two things that are dead certain. Complexity and uncertainty is a phrase of mine. They are the enemy of security. If something is highly complex, it's very difficult to secure. And if you have an uncertain environment with lots of changing factors in, it's really difficult to enforce security in there as well. And that really comes down to your TPRM process as well as your broader security strategy as well. So in a world like that, contracts and ways of working have to be absolutely crystal clear. Who is the data owner? A little bit of a clue, that's always yourself. As I said earlier, you can't outsource that. So recognizing that it doesn't matter what contract you're putting in place, it doesn't matter who's doing the day-to-day activity, you remain that data owner. Who's going to actually interact and process the data? And when you get into really sensitive information, payment records, etc., you have to get down to individual names. You have to be able to be distance managing who's got access to your information on a day-to-day basis. What's their joiners, movers, leavers process? If someone's left the organization, is their access revoked instantly? And any new joiners coming in, if they're accessing sensitive information, have we done the right level of vetting around them as well? What compliance requirements apply to those individual citizens' data in individual countries, because it does differ. For some nations, for example, even if you're outsourcing, it has to be, someone from that nation origin actually accessing that data. And that's, either too difficult to do, so it doesn't happen, but, you still have to factor that in, that's a requirement. And, a good way to move forward here is to identify what perfect looks like. I found, when going into a new space or doing something like this, to make sure that you find out what perfect looks like. Reach out to your peer organizations. I rarely find that people are competitive with each other when it comes to cyber or information security. I think people are, willing to be really open and transparent around, what they do and the processes to people that they trust or circles of trust. So, get involved with, discussion groups and forums, and just make sure that you're capturing how other people do it, and then make sure that you put, similar processes in place. You don't have to start with a blank sheet of paper here. So let's look at the ESG and CSR risk. So depending on where you are, whatever you want to call it, as I say, we want to be good citizens. We want to make sure that we're doing the right things from an organizational perspective. We all want to have great products and services, but we need to recognize that the world is a very big place, and it's not always the same as how we would recognize it in our home countries as well. So whether it's, just to expand the acronyms, so, corporate social responsibility, we want to make sure we're doing the right things, or ESG, we want to make sure we're protecting the environment, we're doing the right social aspects, and we want to make sure we've got the right governance, etc. So one of the trends that we'll all recognize is offshoring and outsourcing. And one of the key drivers to do that is to reduce cost. So one of the key things that happens is we go to lower cost regions of the world, still high skill, but a lower price band, so that we can reduce the operational overhead on that service, which has a knock-on impact on the profitability of our organization. But we need to recognize, as I said, that not all places are the same. Not all countries have the same level of corporate ethics as we may enjoy. And some locations, it's clear that employees are still exploited. But that's a fact. We just have to face up to it. In some other countries, certainly in my past, I've had to deal with this. The payments of bribes to, say, grease the wheels, or to somehow make highly complex bureaucracies disappear overnight. They've been commonplace for generations. It's a very normal way of working for some people in some of these locations. But I'd say for most of us on this call, obviously I don't know all the geographies that we're dialing in from, but I'd say for most of us, we have some legal and other compliance regulations that would stipulate that that is illegal for our company to operate in that manner. So we then have this challenge where we have to operate our way of working, our ethics, our belief systems, etc., our company culture. And we have to, I'll say impose, because that's a strong word, but that's what I mean. We have to impose that way of working on a distant geography. And it doesn't matter about the way that they've traditionally worked. If they want to work with our organization and have our business, these are the standards that we will impose. And then we have the challenge of making sure that it's done in the first place, but equally making sure that we've got the right governance over it to make sure that it continues after the contract's awarded. And we've all in the news and newspapers, etc., issues like this coming up. We've seen oil spills, for example, damaging the environment. We've seen trainer or sneaker manufacturers using child labor. We've seen coffee manufacturers paying a not livable wage to its workforce. And we all know how much a cup of coffee costs these days, right? So the margins must be immense. So, paying the people that actually grow the product and roast the product and do the picking of the coffee beans, etc., making sure that they have a fair wage for a fair product is really important to most organizations. And that's only a few examples. Even people working for call centers, etc. So it's really thinking, what does my organization do? Where are we outsourced? What's our commitments? What's our ethical stances? What's our compliance and legal regulatories in this environment? And how do we make sure we've got that effective governance process going over it? It's really making sure, I say as security professionals, but this is all broader than security, but it all feeds into your TPRM program. We have to make sure we fully understand, that full chain of custody within the supply chain. And then there's financial risk, right? So, we saw in the global COVID pandemic, and, that was a big surprise for all of us. Most information security professionals, if you sign up to NIST or ISO or something like that, you've always had a global pandemic flu policy within your arsenal. But, most people would have thought it was quite unrealistic and, never thought it would see the light of day, but actually it did. And we've all seen that, the organizations that suffered from that didn't have the, appropriate IT infrastructure for their employees to immediately work from home, didn't have the ability to pivot quickly in terms of how they operated or delivered products and services to their customers, and rapidly take things online from physical premises and things like that. So that really impacted the bottom line and the balance sheet of several organizations. And then we throw into that mix, we're coming out of that world now, but you look across the planet at the moment, right? We've got a mixture of rising inflation, we've got rising interest rates, we've got increased borrowing by governments across the globe. And then to compound that from organizations, we've got the highest rate of crypto malware than we've ever seen, attacking organizations, literally encrypting their data and holding them to ransom. So, if they haven't got the right insurance in place, that can, we saw with, several organizations around the world, that actually had a crypto malware incident. Their finances couldn't hold up to it. They weren't insured, or their policy at the time didn't actually include the payment. They didn't have the ability to restore that organization quickly, and actually went under. And that can happen to, pretty much any organization if they haven't got the right plans in place. So we need to be proactive and think all of this through. We need to ask the questions that are probing, not just around cyber and information security, but how liquid is this organization? How capable are its finances to withstand some of the things that we've just discussed? And how stable is it? Could it potentially falter overnight for some of the examples? So what can we do? What is the trend with each supplier? Most large organizations release their financial statements to the public, so we can start to consume that information and understand, what is the trend? Are they getting more free cash flow within that organization? Are they downpaying debt, or are they getting less cash flow and accumulating more debt? Does it start to look more risky year on year, or does that risk start to go down? Have they, insured against, potential impacts to their organization? Not just from a cyber risk perspective, but from a business impact perspective. So, are they insured against the losses that they might, incur from not being able to service their suppliers? So looking at that Revlon, for example, have they hedged that potential risk from occurring, and they've got that covered off from the insurance market or not? And actually, where are they based? Where are their locations around the globe? Where are they headquartered? Have they got the ability to, be manipulated or be challenged by, corrupt governments? Are they potentially exposed to political instability? So, all of these things absolutely factor in. And getting that accurate information is really key. But as I said at the beginning, life cycling that is really equally important, just to make sure that we've got all of that information to our fingertips, and that we can disseminate that within our organizations to the people that need to, consume that and be able to make risk-based decisions going forward. So in terms of, just before I hand over to Scott, what can we do differently? What would really make a difference? So I think we have to work collaboratively. We're often, and I'm guilty of this as well, we're cyber and information security professionals, and there may be many other disciplines on the call as well. But as I said, the more active users of this, this tool and this technology and this process is information security professionals. We have to recognize that we don't have all the answers. We've got a certain mindset and a certain view of how we approach problems. We need to collaborate widely within our organization. So, as I said, please look at my webinar I did about collaboration with the procurement function, and you'll find that the CISO and the director of procurement, or the chief procurement officer, have really overlapping accountabilities when it comes to risk, and lots of the shared performance indicators. So making sure that you tap into those different functions with the different expertise. So working with HR, legal, finance to make sure that we've set up the right KPIs so that we can start to see when things go wrong. What we don't want to do is, find out when the wheels have completely fallen off. There is, lead and lag indicators where we can start to see challenges starting to creep in. And when we see those, we can start to understand, well, what would our response be? Most mature organizations wouldn't put all their eggs in one basket with a single critical supplier. So you would already have that resilience baked in, whether it's, you get raw materials from, 2 or 3 different suppliers that are geographically dispersed. So if there is an impact, then it doesn't obviously, have a huge issue for you. Then obviously ensure you're operating holistically across your supplier footprint. As I said, most organizations that use a tool like Prevalent have the ability to do this. You have the ability to, program in where your suppliers are, providing products and services to you around the globe. But if you're running a manual process, this might be a bit of a challenge in terms of hooking into, especially if you're multinational, where your suppliers are interacting with your organization. So where possible, create that global process, make sure that you're operating, that single process globally, and then, making sure that you've got that nth relationships really thought out throughout your organization. And then really, model scenarios. Certainly before COVID hit, a good CISO that I know did an exercise with their boardroom about a global pandemic flu, and everyone thought it was really good. I think the CEO pulled him aside afterwards and said, can we choose a scenario that's a little bit more likely next time? But then obviously, a couple of months later, something like COVID did hit. It's a really sensible investment to sit down with your distributed, stakeholders and actually model, what would happen if the Suez Canal got blocked again and we couldn't get our, manufacturing goods to our customers, or we couldn't get our raw materials in. What would happen, what's the impact on our organization with the Houthis at the moment in the Red Sea, diverting 200 billion of trade and adding weeks to the transit time to some countries and locations. All of these things have impacts, and there's a lot of value in modeling a few of these scenarios. So yes, do the traditional cyber ones, but equally think wider and actually understand, well, what actually could impact our organization? Because it's not always a cyber attack. And I think if we are responsible for this risk process, we have to be able to guide the business effectively. And that's obviously thinking broader and wider than cyber. And then you have to have your finger on the pulse. Obviously, you have to, have those real-time threat intelligence feeds. Again, something you can't have with a manual process. You can put in who your critical suppliers on. You can have, pretty much real-time monitor on what's going on. You can see what other people have found out about them, and that's really critical that you can, be near real time when it comes to managing and monitoring your supplier footprint. When there was, the challenge with Neon that I said earlier in the chip manufacturing, there was actually an employee at IBM who was pretty much on the ball and, recognized that this would be a big issue, and bulk bought, and have been bulk bought in millions of tons for that organization to make sure that they didn't have service disruptions. Not all organizations would have had that real-time intel. Not all organizations would have been able to react, because this guy knew he had air cover in advance to be able to do something like that. So really work it through and make sure it's built into your global process. Because as it says at the bottom there, if you are running a really effective supplier risk program, you will have, arguably thought through pretty much everything that can happen in your supply chain that can disrupt, you running your product and services. And then it comes down to, a cost perspective, how much are you willing to invest to hedge that risk? Is it going to an insurance provider? Is it putting, a couple of other suppliers on your books that can offer the same product and service, just to make sure that you've hedged that risk going forward? Good. Hope you find that useful, and there's lots of questions for me. I'm just going to hand over to Scott to do a few slides, and then we'll get into the Q&A. So Scott, over to you.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Brian. And you can continue on to the next slide if you'd like. One of the things that I really took away from Brian's discussion is, this very diverse field of risk types that we have to be aware of. And we have all fallen into that trap where you're kind of worried primarily about the cybersecurity risks that a vendor or supplier introduces to the organization in one of two ways. One way being a software supply chain risk. You're doing business with or you bought a piece of software, you employ it in the organization, it turns into a move it or SolarWinds type situation. The code gets compromised. All of a sudden, that code is in your environment. Well, that code could also be in your third party's environments as well. And if they're managing your data or have connections into your systems, again, that's a route to your organization. Second cyber risk is the risk of a breach, right? A PJ&A type situation where a medical billing provider, for example, that's managing your customer database to issue medical billing gets attacked, your customer information gets compromised, and all of a sudden it ends up for sale out there on the dark web somewhere. That's liability for you. It's those things that get all the press. But as Bryan said earlier in the presentation, it's some of these, sneakier, less tangible, more qualitative type of risks that can lurk in the background that, we really need to keep our eye on to avoid them turning into some sort of a disruption for us in the future. Supply chain impact, supply chain disruption, somebody gets acquired, or there's an M&A in a vendor. All of a sudden that creates a strategic implication for your ecosystem. Anyway, so kind of what we see organizations struggling with from a third-party risk management perspective are really three things as they're kind of trying to get their arms around the program, build up that program, whatever. And that's number one, manual processes. We do a survey every year to the industry, and one of the questions we ask in that survey is, are you using spreadsheets, or what tools do you use to manage a third-party risk management program? Almost half, 48% of respondents said they rely solely on spreadsheets to manage their third-party risk program. And I know many of you are on the phone today. It's okay. There's always a great place to start to kind of ditch your spreadsheets, and this might be the day to do that, day to make that choice. Very manual process. You understand the risks involved in manual process. It's hard to keep it up to date. It's hard to get real-time information. It's hard to map controls in a spreadsheet very effectively to remediations, and in effect close the loop on the problem of third-party risk. Second is that study showed that roughly 20% of companies are tracking risks across at least one stage of the third-party vendor supplier risk lifecycle. 20%, 2 out of 10, are tracking risks across that lifecycle. That's problematic. I think the natural inclination for us is to do a pretty deep due diligence assessment when you're onboarding a vendor, or when you're evaluating a vendor, to see if you want to do business with them, get a look at their cyber posture, their competitive posture, their financial posture, their ESG scores, reputational issues, whatever. And then once it's done, we kind of move on. We're comfortable. They match the risk appetite of the business. We move forward with them, and then we do some periodic reassessments. But then after that, time happens, and then, we, as is human nature, we tend to focus on the next big problem. And maybe we have some vendors that we've had in the life cycle for a while, we're doing business with, that are still continuing to present us some risks. And the data would show that, few companies are really looking at risks from, cradle to grave. Third is this, crazy situation where everybody's got their hand on the plow in third-party risk management in many organizations. 71% of companies report that the InfoSec team owns third-party risk, but 63% say the procurement team owns the relationship. So I'll pose that question to you. Is that your environment, right? So you maybe being on the security or the compliance or the third-party risk team are the one that's probably tasked with managing the assessment process, or understanding, what type of information you have to manage, with regard to the third party, but it's really the procurement team that has the day-to-day contact with them, maybe, or is at least paying the bills. So they need to be kept in the loop. That dichotomy, that ownership, if it's not managed appropriately, if you're not delivering the right type of insights for all stakeholders involved, could lead to some conflict, or at worst, a hot potato where nobody really manages the relationship. Next slide, please, Bryan. Ultimately, what we kind of understand from doing this for 20 years is that organizations, want to achieve these three things from their third-party risk management programs. First is to get the data they need to make better decisions. We talked about how manual that process is. We talked about how disparate data sources lead to maybe not a real-time, kind of approach there, or not looking at risk throughout the life cycle. Second, increasing team efficiency and knocking down silos. If your IT security team, needs to execute an assessment to understand the security posture of a potential vendor or supplier, procurement team wants to know what's their their financial health, can they pay their bills, we've got good credit rating. Maybe the compliance or risk management team wants to know, do they have any reputational issues? Have they been in the news? Are there any product quality problems to worry about? Things like that. What ends up happening is you get 3 different audiences who want to know a little bit of information about this third party. And very rarely do we find in enterprises of any size the ability to bring all that stuff together so that you have like one view into that third party, regardless of the type of risk you want to manage. And then third is evolve and scale your program over time. I mean, look, I get it. It's a challenge, right? You got to be prepared for new third parties, for decommissioning, vendors you no longer do business with. And you need some elasticity in your processes and your solutions to, allow you to do that. And, spreadsheets, manual processes, whatever, just aren't going to do the trick there. Next slide, please, Brian. What we seek to do is to look at risk holistically across a third-party vendor or supplier relationship. Our recognition is that, we see risk at every stage of that relationship, from the point where you decide to source a new vendor and choose them and onboard them, to the point where that contract expires and you're not interested in renewing and you want to offboard the vendor and terminate the contract and the relationship. Each of those stages presents unique risks, and they present those unique risks to multiple different teams, throughout the organization, whether it's not really having good risk-based insights to a potential vendor that you want to select. It's one thing to determine that a vendor or supplier's offering is fit for purpose, but are they fit to your company's risk profile, right? Traditional RFX processes typically, don't resolve that issue. Second, when it comes to onboarding, the contractual process we find tends to not, be integrated very well with the risk analysis or the risk mitigation process. Wouldn't it be great if there was a way to unify the management of KPIs, KRIs, SLAs, performance measures in a contract, and treat them as risks of non-performance or missing expectations or cyber risks or something, to manage this kind of stuff all together. A third big challenge we see is all the manual processes required to measure inherent risk. You don't really know, you don't have a good handle on what the next step should be if you don't have a starting point to say, okay, these particular group of vendors have, a high risk profile in this area. We need to kind of go deep here to determine, what their policies are in data privacy, for example. Third, assessment and remediation. We talked about ditching spreadsheets and manual processes and things like that, but I think a critical success factor here for you in an assessment process is having a library of questionnaires or questions that address the risks that different departments throughout your enterprise are going to be wanting to know more about. As I said, financial team wants to know this, or procurement team wants to know this, IT team wants to know that. Doing kind of like a manual spreadsheet-based process, or maybe looking at like one questionnaire, just typically isn't going to make anybody happy. Monitoring and validation is kind of the fifth step in the process, and kind of what we see here is where these kind of silos of information start to emerge from one another. You get a cyber score, you get an ESG score, you get a financial, credit rating, something like that. Well, what do you do with all that? Like if you're the one kind of managing the relationship, or, who do you share that information with? How do you share it? In what format? How does that impact decision making? Third, SLAs and performance. We kind of talked about the integration there between contracting and risk management. And then finally, offboarding. You get to the point where, it's time to end that relationship. What we see is a lot of organizations don't have a very prescriptive onboarding process that is centralized with, task assignment, prioritization, and more that kind of allows you to very safely and securely say, okay, we're done here, and all these items have been checked off. We can move on. Next slide, please, Brian. What we do to address this problem is a combination of 3 things. Number one is, we've got, a third-party risk management platform that's leveraged by our internal managed services team, if you choose to go that route. But we will execute all of the third-party risk effort on your behalf. That includes onboarding vendors, performing inherent risk scoring, issuing assessments, analyzing, making remediation recommendations, helping out with contracts, whatever. We cover the entire third-party risk lifecycle soup to nuts. If you want to do it yourself, that's okay too, because we've got the platform to do that. The second piece of the equation is data. I mean, I would stack up our platform against any other platform in the industry in terms of the amount of intelligence and the quality of intelligence that we've imported into the platform and then present to you in very intelligent looking scorecards and also into central risk registers to help to validate the presence of certain controls. And that data is important for good decision making. And then third, I mentioned the platform, right? The ability to house all of the workflow, the questionnaires, the risks, the reporting, the compliance frameworks, and more in a single platform to help you, reduce the amount of time and all that soul crushing effort to execute on your risk assessments. Next slide, please, Brian. Kind of the heart of today's presentation is, we do this for a heck of a lot of different types of risks, and I've just plunked 6 categories of them here on the slide right now, and all the little bullet points are the pieces of intelligence or the questionnaires that we have on the platform to help you kind of gather this information. Core cyber, business operational, financial, ESG, reputational, and compliance. And again, we centralize this information in the platform to help you make good risk-based decisions on whether or not you want to do business with a particular vendor or keep doing business with a vendor or kind of recommend remediations to get to a place where you're happy with a residual risk score that aligns with the rest of the company. Next slide, please, Brian. And I think that's all I wanted to share with you today, was just kind of how we can help address the problem of multiple different risk types in the environment and how we can bring that together in a single solution, help you do some analytics, some reporting, some remediations to ultimately mitigate that risk on a long-term basis. That's all I want to share with you today. I think, Matt, we'll pick it back over to you and we'll open it up for questions.
All righty. Thank you very much, Scott. Okay, let's see here. So now would actually be a great time for you guys all to drop in any more questions you have into that Q&A box. I'm going to launch the last poll right now on the screen while you do that, so that we can follow up with you regarding any TPRM projects on your radar. Essentially, just basically, would you like a follow-up from Prevalent to discuss enhancing your TPRM program? And just, please be honest, because we really do follow up with you. So let me launch that poll for you real quick. Right, poll's going. And we do have, looks like, a little bit more questions than time, Brian. So I'm going to give you the first look if you have any questions you see that jump out at you. Otherwise, happy to pick one and we can go through some. Nope, you're on mute, it looks like.
Yeah, I'll just whiz through some, Matt, for you, if that's okay. So we got questions around,
Sure.
what documentation do we need to monitor subcontractors so that nth, thing that we were talking about earlier, you actually need to ask them the same questions you'd ask your primary supplier, right? So if they're getting access to, the data, you need to know everything about them as well, location, ownership models, product, services, locations, etc. So it's an extension. So it's not additional, it's a replication of what you would ask your existing supplier and, carry that over to those guys as well. A couple of questions on ESG, not clear about the relationship between ESG and the challenges it poses to your TPRM function. So, just imagine one of your key suppliers was, found to, be involved in child slavery or significant health and safety breaches, etc. And obviously newspapers get wind of it and say company X uses child labor, etc. So that's not something that you really want your brand associated with. So those are the linkages, right? And recognizing that there's regulatory and legal drivers to make sure that that doesn't happen. I think, most companies have an accountability to push those into your supply chain just to make sure they don't occur. Scott, the thing I wanted for you from Patrick, the current SIG being ported to the Prevalent tool.
Yeah. Yeah, question is, can the current SIG be imported into the prevalent tool to identify the inherent and residual risk ratings, then compare it with the business risk appetite? The answer to that is yes. We have already imported SIG 2024 into the prevalent platform. Then you can migrate previous answers from 2023 and before into the new version before you start assessing your suppliers using 2024 this year. And that includes the inherent and residual risk analysis, and then the mappings to business risk, and then the framework mappings for compliance as well.
Right. And then we've got a question, what are the top 3 items one should focus on when trying to mature a TPRM organization? No, I any cybersecurity question, right? People, process, technology. And I saw Scott had people, data, platform on his slide 19. So it's, fairly similar, right? So we need to make sure you've got the right people, skilled people that can recognize the output that the tool's giving you and, drive appropriate action within your organization. You need like global processes and good data sets to make sure that you're getting a good holistic picture. And then as Scott said, and I've said several times on this webinar, if you are running a manual process today, I think, it's a good place to start, but the world has definitely moved on. I think, look at what a tool like Prevalent can do for you, and we kind of, recognize the transformation in, your ability to serve risk for your organization. There's another one around, is there a reason why the business unit contracting the service doesn't own the relationship with the customer? I think that comes down to individual organizations. I've certainly worked for organizations where they haven't had centralized procurement and they do own, the relationship with the the end user. I think that, it's setting it up so it's collaborative. I think as long as you've got that single view, that's really critical. You don't want procurement having a view of the client base and you having another, because obviously then you're both guiding the business in different ways. So I think that's really, really critical. Scott, do you want to take that one with Prevalent? Can we opt into one specific risk intelligence category, for example, only financial?
Yeah, absolutely. The short answer to the question is yes. If you only want to monitor financial risk for vendors, you can absolutely do that with a Prevalent platform. But the biggest value you get from the platform is looking at risk holistically across multiple different types for multiple different internal enterprise teams. So yeah, there are tools out there that might be able to, D&B, credit safe, whatever, give you a financial report for vendors, but it's what you do with the data that matters. And then that's the value that we provide, is that we take the data, we map it to potential risks and flags and alerts, and then let you take action on it.
Good. And the last one, Scott's for you as well.
Yeah. The question is, if I use the tool to send the SIG as a questionnaire, but my vendor returns the SIG to me via email, can I upload their answers into the questionnaire I sent? The answer is yes, you can do that. And then you can call up that vendor and just holler at them on the phone for doing that.
Yeah. Good, Matt, we did it.
All right. Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much, Bryan, and of course, Scott as well. And thanks, everyone, for all the questions. So if you do want to stay in the TPRM loop, feel free to add us on LinkedIn. And then lastly, I hope to see a handful of you in your inboxes and maybe even at one of our future webinars. So thanks very much again, everybody, and take care.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.
Take care, everybody. Bye now.
Cheers.